She was just a waitress in Dallas, even healing a boy's wound with a simple gesture of affection that not even an oil magnate's fortune could heal seems impossible, doesn't it? But what happened that dark night, when a single scream of terror became the key to freeing an entire family? Forever changed the lives of a father paralyzed by grief, a child haunted by the past, and a woman no one imagined had the power to save them. Before we start this journey, subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and tell us in the comments which city you are watching us from. The Texas night fell heavy and humid, a blanket of heat that seemed to muffle the distant sound of traffic on the Dallas North Tollway. Inside the wrought iron gates of a Highland Park estate, the Carter Mansion stood as a monument to silence. But it wasn't a peaceful silence. It was a dense stillness heavy with the weight of unspoken words and a grief that refused to be forgotten. The strategically placed garden lights bathed the ancient oaks and imposing brick facade in a warm, golden glow, a stark contradiction to the chill that dominated the interior. Inside, the air conditioner hummed low, maintaining an almost glacial temperature. The smell was a complex mix of antique book leather wafting from Will's study, polished walnut wood, and the faint, stubborn scent of gardenias, Caroline's favorite scent, which housekeeper Brenda insisted on keeping in crystal vases as if to preserve the late lady's very presence. Every object, from the silver spurs framed on the wall to the vast Navajo tapestry in the foyer, spoke of power, history, and generational wealth. But to the discerning eye, the house was nothing more than an impeccably decorated mausoleum, a grand stage where a family of two was slowly disintegrating into darkness. In the South Wing guest suite, Grace Evans felt the weight of that silence like a physical pressure. The room was a masterpiece of interior design, with a four-poster bed, sheets that felt like silk, and a view of the floodlit pool that glowed like sapphire in the darkness of the garden. On her mahogany desk, her nursing textbooks lay open, the pages on pediatrics and psychological trauma underlined with yellow highlighter. She tried to study, to memorize the stages of childhood grief, but the theory seemed like a cruel joke compared to the reality of what was happening in the room down the hall. Her thoughts were consumed by Leo. She could almost feel the boy's loneliness, a tiny island in an ocean of empty hallways. A protective, almost maternal feeling had taken hold in her heart, a dangerous feeling that was wholly unbecoming of her position. She looked down at her hands, the short, practiced nails, the small scars from accidental burns at the diner. They were working hands, hands that seemed to belong to another universe, and yet they were the only hands in that house that seemed to know how to hold Leo's without hesitation, offering a simple, genuine warmth that no luxury could replicate. In the study across the house, Will Carter sat in a leather chair that creaked softly beneath his weight. Surrounded by the trophies of his life, pictures with governors, a framed drilling helmet, geological maps of promising oil fields, he felt like an utter failure. The heavy crystal tumbler in his hand held 3 fingers of bourbon, and the way the amber liquid caught the light from the desk lamp was the only thing he could focus on. In his other hand, he held the object of his nightly ritual, a silver-framed photo of Caroline. She was smiling, wearing a cowboy hat at a charity event, her eyes shining with a life he felt had been extinguished from the entire universe. Each sip of bourbon was an attempt to numb the guilt. Guilt for not being with her on the road that rainy day. Guilt for drowning himself in work, using his empire as a shield against the pain. And the latest, most bitter guilt. The guilt of feeling a relief, a breath of fresh air whenever Grace was near, whenever he heard the sound of her laughing with Leo. It felt like an unforgivable betrayal of his wife's memory, and yet some part of him, the exhausted and lonely part, yearned desperately for more of that light. Leo lay in his bed, his eyes open in the dim light, staring at the constellations painted on his ceiling by a high-tech projector. His room was a Texas boy's dream, with a subtle Western theme, a leather lasso hanging on the wall, a collection of toy horses neatly lined up on a shelf. But none of that mattered when night fell. Beside him on the bed was Bevo, a stuffed animal shaped like a longhorn steer, the mascot of the college where his parents had met. Bevo's fur was frayed in places from being held so much, and it smelled of him, of Leo, and of a ghostly scent from his mother, Caroline. He clutched the stuffed animal tightly, as if it were a talisman against the monsters that awaited him in his sleep. He liked Grace. She told stories and didn't treat him like he was made of glass. But even the memory of her smile wasn't enough to calm the anxiety bubbling in his stomach. He could feel the fear coming, a dark tide slowly rising, promising to drag him back into the noise, into the smell of rain and twisted metal, into the terrifying silence that came after his mother's voice had faded forever. Brenda, the housekeeper, moved around the house with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew every inch of her domain. With nearly 40 years of service to the Carter family, first to Will's parents and then to him, Brenda saw herself not as an employee, but as the curator of the family legacy. And the heart of that legacy was Caroline's memory. Every pot of gardenias she replaced, every photograph of Caroline she reverently dusted was an act of loyalty. As she passed through the upstairs hallway, her gaze fell on Grace's closed bedroom door. Her lips pressed together in a thin line of disapproval. She viewed the young woman not with the gratitude Will seemed to feel, but with deep suspicion. Grace was an anomaly, an outside force disrupting the sacred order of mourning. Her laughter, her games, her casual approach, it all seemed an attempt to erase Caroline's presence, to replace elegance and tradition with something ordinary, something from a roadside diner. In Brenda's mind, grief was something to be borne with dignity and silence, not something to be cured with napkin tricks and small talk. She promised herself, as she did every night, that she would not allow her mistress's memory to be disrespected. She would keep watch. The mansion finally fell into near silence. Will fell asleep in his office chair, his bourbon glass empty. Brenda retreated to her quarters, her mind still racing with plans to protect her territory. Grace, unable to concentrate, finally gave up her books and lay down, listening to the sounds of the house, the ever-present hum of the air conditioner, the occasional creak of the house settling, the distant sound of a siren cutting through the Dallas night. These were the sounds of loneliness. Each of the inhabitants of this house was on their own island, separated from the others by an ocean of unspoken grief. The opulence around them, the plush carpets, the artwork, the perfectly manicured gardens, only served to amplify the emptiness within. The entire house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something that would break the spell of silence, a force strong enough to break through the barriers they had so carefully built around themselves. And the strength was coming, not from outside, but from the epicenter of that family's pain, from the room of the boy who was fighting a lonely battle against his own memories. The dream gripped him with its usual violence. There was no soft start, just an instant immersion into chaos. Sound came first, the deafening thud of rain hitting the roof of the car, the soft sound of a country song on the radio, and beneath it all the voice of his mother, Caroline, laughing at something he had said. Then the high-pitched, drawn-out screech of tires on wet asphalt, the smell of burning rubber, the feel of his body being thrown sideways, the seatbelt biting into his chest, and the noise, a sound of metal tearing, of glass shattering into a million tiny, dangerous diamonds. And then the darkness. It wasn't a peaceful darkness, but a darkness full of sounds and smells, the smell of gasoline, and his mother's voice, different now, tense, calling his name. Leo. Leo, honey, are you okay? He tried to answer, but his throat was tight. There was a sharp pain in his legs, a pain he didn't understand. He tried to turn toward her, but he was trapped. Her voice grew fainter. Stay with me, my love. Stay. And then silence. The silence was the worst part. The silence where her voice should have been. And panic, cold and absolute, washed over him. He was alone, and he was losing her forever. A scream tore through the stillness of the Highland Park mansion. It wasn't a cry, but a howl of pure animal terror, the sound of a child's soul being torn apart. The scream rose from Leo's bedroom, traveled through the silk-lined hallways, down the curved staircase, and exploded into the open, silent spaces of the floor below. It was the sound of the family's wound, the sound they spent all day trying to drown out with work and routine and silence. In her suite, Grace jumped from the bed, her heart hammering in her throat. The sound hit her not as a noise, but as a physical blow. Leo. In the study, Will was jolted out of his alcoholic stupor. The scream sobered him instantly, the crystal glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the thick carpet. He knew that sound. It was the echo of his own nightmares. In the back of the house, Brenda, who had been reading her Bible, froze. Her face became a mask of grim concern. In her mind, it was proof that something was terribly wrong. Confirmation that the order she had fought so hard to maintain was being irretrievably broken. The house, once a silent mausoleum, now pulsed with a single point of agony. Grace didn't hesitate for a split second. Instinct, honed by her nursing classes and strengthened by months of restrained affection, took over. She was out of bed, bare feet on the soft carpet, before her conscious mind could even process what she was doing. She didn't stop to grab a robe or slippers. Wearing only an old t-shirt and knit shorts, she ran out of her room. The long, imposing hallway, normally a reminder of how out of place she was now just a path to be traversed as quickly as possible. The stern-eyed oil portraits of the Carter ancestors seemed to watch her pass, a small, determined figure running toward the epicenter of the chaos. The sound of her own feet was a dull thud on the carpet, an urgent rhythm against Leo's terrified sobs that were now becoming clearer. There was no plan in her mind, no textbook technique. There was just an overwhelming urge, a primal need to reach that child, to wrap her in safety and tell her somehow that she was not alone in that darkness. She reached the solid oak door of Leo's room just as Will came running up the grand staircase. Their labored breaths mingled in the cold air of the hallway. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, they stared at each other, the sound of Leo's sobs filling the space between them. In Will's face, the oil tycoon accustomed to ruling the world, Grace saw only the naked despair of a father. He was pale, his perfectly coiffed hair now in disarray, his eyes wide with a fear that mirrored his son's. And in Grace's eyes, Will saw something that shocked him, a fierce calm. It wasn't the absence of fear, but the presence of unwavering determination, a strength that seemed completely out of proportion to her delicate appearance. In that exchanged look, the definitions of boss and maid were incinerated. They were just two people confronting a pain that was too great for one. A step behind them, Brenda's figure appeared, her face a mask of authority and disapproval, ready to take control, to restore order, unaware that the order she knew was about to be shattered forever. Will's hesitation lasted only a second, but in the silent hallway it felt like an eternity. The air was charged with the electricity of crisis. It was then that Brenda stepped forward, her movement precise and authoritative, moving around the frozen figure of her employer. She positioned herself between him and Grace, a human barrier of loyalty and tradition. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice low but with the steely timbre she used to direct the household staff. "Leave it to me. I know what he needs." It was a clear demarcation of her territory, an attempt to restore the order she felt was unraveling. Her "I know" was a claim to decades of service, an assertion that she and she alone knew the secrets and pain of this family. To Brenda, Grace's empathy was a weakness, a sentimental approach that she saw only coddled the pain rather than disciplined it. In his mind, what Leo needed was not a whisper, but a firm hand to pull him back to reality, to teach him to bear his pain with the same stoic dignity expected of a Carter. Grace felt the wall Brenda had erected between her and Will, felt the housekeeper's cold disapproval and the story of power she represented. A sensible person would have stepped back, given in to the hierarchy, allowed the senior to take over. But as Leo sobbed again, something inside Grace solidified. It wasn't defiance, it was purpose. She ignored Brenda as if she were invisible and fixed her gaze directly on Will. Her eyes didn't plead, they communicated. There was an urgency in them, a clarity that said, "Your methods have failed. Silence has failed. Distance has failed. Please trust me. Let me try." And then she acted. Her hand moved with deliberate calm and settled on the polished brass doorknob. She didn't turn it. She just held it. The cool feel of the metal on her skin was real, a focal point in the chaos. That simple gesture was her answer to Brenda and her final question to Will. The fate of that night, the course of that healing, rested on the broken father's choice. Will looked at Grace's determined face, and for the first time in months, he made a decision that wasn't based on fear or habit. He gave a barely perceptible nod. It was enough. When Grace pushed open the door and the light from the hallway flooded the dim room, Leo's terror became an overwhelming force. It was a scene of contained chaos. The boy lay in the center of his king-size bed, thrashing beneath an expensive quilt, his legs trapped in the fabric like an animal in a trap. His small face was flushed, bathed in sweat and tears, his eyes open but blind to the real world, fixed on a horror only he could see. The star projector on the ceiling, which should have brought peace, now seemed to mock him, a cold universe indifferent to his agony. The air was stale, heavy with the metallic smell of panic. On the floor beside the bed, the stuffed longhorn, Bevo, lay forgotten, a totem of a past happiness that could no longer protect him. The juxtaposition was cruel. A room perfectly designed for the comfort and security of a child of the Texas elite, now the scene of primitive and lonely suffering. Grace took in the scene, her heart clenching, but her nurse's mind began to work, assessing, analyzing, searching for a way to enter that fortress of fear without causing further damage. Will stood in the doorway, a tall, helpless figure haunted by ghosts. The sight of his son, trapped and terrified, was not just a present scene, it was a direct, brutal echo of the past. In his mind, the sound of Leo's sobs mixed with the sound of rain pelting the twisted metal of the car that day on I-35. The smell of panic in the room mixed with the smell of gasoline and wet asphalt. He was back on that side of the road, watching the paramedics work, hearing the sirens, feeling the same crushing futility of being unable to do anything to take away his son's pain, to erase the horror from his boy's eyes. He, Will Carter, a man who could move mountains with a phone call, who negotiated with princes and presidents, felt his feet in expensive leather boots nailed to the ground. He wanted to run, he wanted to scream. He wanted to hold his son until the world made sense again, but his body wouldn't obey. Trauma had its own chains, and in that moment they held him tighter than ever. He was a spectator to his own tragedy, repeated through his son's pain. Brenda, standing just behind Will, saw the same scene, but her interpretation was completely different. To her, the chaos in Leo's room was proof that she had been right all along. It was the result of Grace's permissiveness, of her modern ideas about feelings and expression. In Caroline's era, things were different. There was structure. There was discipline. A child did not give in to such hysteria. She felt a surge of righteous indignation. Her instinct was to impose order. She would have gone in, turned on the lights, spoken in a firm, unquestioning voice to reason Leo. She believed that pain, especially in a boy, should be met with stoicism, not tears. "This is what happens when you pat yourself on the head," she murmured, her voice low enough for only Will to hear. The criticism was a weapon, an attempt to undermine Grace's authority and reassert herself as the only one who truly understood the needs of this family. She didn't see Leo's pain as something to be cured gently, but as a disorder to be corrected firmly. Grace moved into the room, ignoring the tension at the door. Her bare feet barely made a sound on the thick carpet. She didn't go straight to the bed. First, she walked around it, making sure Leo could see her in his peripheral vision, even if he wasn't really registering her presence. Her movements were slow, non-threatening, and then she knelt. By placing herself lower than his, she subverted any power dynamics. She wasn't an adult coming to control a child, but a human being offering herself to another. It was only then that she spoke, and her voice, with its soft, natural southern drawl, was a balm. "Leo, honey, it's me, Grace," she whispered, the sound low and steady. "I'm right here with you. You're not alone in this. I'm here." She didn't tell him to stop crying. She didn't tell him it was just a dream. She validated the reality of his terror, but she added a new element to it, her presence. She was offering herself as an anchor in the midst of his storm, a calm, real voice amid the screams of his memory. It was a technique she had read about in her books, but one her heart executed with a perfection no book could teach. As she continued to murmur comforting words, creating an audible sense of safety, Grace slowly reached out. She didn't aim for Leo's face or chest, but for his forearm, a neutral place. She placed her hand there, and the contact was electric. Leo jerked, his entire body twitching as if he'd been shocked. His skin was feverish and clammy. Someone else might have pulled their hand away, startled by his reaction. But Grace held it there, firm, yet incredibly light. It wasn't a grip to restrain, but a touch to connect. It was a point of constant warm pressure, a signal of the safe, physical world that existed outside the chaos of his mind. Through her palm, she could feel the tremors coursing through his body, the throb of panic. She didn't flinch. She channeled all her calm into that single point of contact, waiting patiently for the sensation of her touch to pierce through the haze of terror. It was an act of faith in the most fundamental of human connections, the ability of a gentle touch to bring someone back from the brink. Will, still in the doorway, watched the scene with a mixture of disbelief and wonder. He had seen Leo's nightmares before, He had seen Brenda's attempts, which usually involved a stern voice and orders to get it together. He had tried them himself, with awkward hugs that seemed to only increase the boy's panic. But this was different. Grace wasn't trying to stop the nightmare. She was entering it. He saw the way she knelt, the way her voice never wavered, the infinite patience in her touch, and he saw the result. He saw Leo's movements, once violent and uncoordinated, begin to slow. He saw the high-pitched screams give way to deep sobs. He was witnessing a form of power he had never known, a power that came not from force or money, but from empathy, and a wave of shame washed over him. Shame for his own helplessness, for his distance, for having let his son fight this battle alone for so long. But beneath the shame, something else began to emerge, a gratitude so deep and overwhelming that it made his eyes sting. He wasn't just grateful, he was amazed. It was in this cocoon of calm that Grace had created that the barrier in Leo's mind finally cracked. A word escaped through his sobs, faint, barely audible. Mommy, and then another. The rain, trapped. They were fragments, broken pieces of the memory that haunted him. It was the first time he had said anything. It had always been only silent terror. Hearing those words was like feeling the earth shake beneath her feet. Grace's heart broke. The reality of this boy's pain was deeper than she had imagined. Tears welled in her own eyes, but she blinked them away, keeping her focus completely on him. She didn't show shock or interrupt him. She leaned in a little closer, her voice even softer. I know, honey. Your mommy, Caroline, was so strong and brave. She used her name. She brought Caroline's memory into the room, not as a ghost, but as a loving presence. And she loved you more than anything in the world. She didn't deny his image of her trapped in the car. Instead, she countered it with the greater truth of her love, the only force that could eventually overcome the trauma. At the mention of his mother's love, the nature of Leo's crying changed. The terror began to subside, giving way to an overwhelming wave of sadness. The pain of loss, which had been hidden beneath the fear of the event, finally surfaced. Knowing that the panic attack was passing, Grace changed her approach. Leo, let's sit down, shall we? Just so you can breathe a little easier. I'm right here with you. With infinite gentleness, she began to untangle the quilt from his legs. Once free, she gently wrapped an arm around his back and helped him to his feet. The moment his body was in a sitting position, Leo's last defense crumbled. He lunged forward and clung to Grace's neck, his small body shaking with deep, freeing sobs. He buried his face in her shoulder, finally allowing himself to feel the pain in a safe place. Grace held him tightly, rocking him gently, absorbing every wave of his grief. And at the door, the sound of that mournful cry, so different from the scream of terror, finally broke Will's paralysis. He was a father. His son was hurting, and for the first time he felt he knew what to do. He took a step into the room. That step into the room was the hardest Will Carter had ever taken in his life. The air was thick with his son's raw pain, and he felt like an intruder in his own home. He who commanded boardrooms with unquestioned authority felt bereft of any tools. What did a father say at a time like this? Words seemed useless. Touch an intrusion. The image of Grace kneeling calmly was his only guide. In a gesture of surrender, he followed her lead, walking around the bed and kneeling on the other side. The Persian rug was soft, but his knees protested, unaccustomed to such a humble posture. He desperately wanted to fix this, wanted to use his vast fortune to buy a solution, a remedy, anything that would erase the terror from his son's eyes. But here, on the floor of Leo's room, he knew his power was useless. With a trembling hand, he reached out and placed it on his son's back, over his cotton pajamas. The touch was clumsy, uncertain, that of a man relearning a language he had long forgotten, the language of simple parental comfort. Leo felt his father's large hand touch his back. For a moment, his small body stiffened. It was an unfamiliar touch. He was used to the clinical touch of doctors, the efficient touch of Brenda, and more recently, the gentle, reassuring touch of Grace. But his father's touch was a rarity, a relic of a time before the pain, of a time with Caroline. Surprise made him catch his breath, but because he was already in the safe haven of Grace's embrace, fear did not overcome him. He did not pull away. He just stood still, a small body tense between two very different presences, Grace's, which was a familiar, constant warmth, and his father's, which was a new presence. hesitant, but undeniably there. For Will, the absence of rejection was like the first rain after a long drought. The fact that his son did not cower in fear was a small victory, a ray of light in the darkness of his guilt. He kept his hand there, not moving, just offering his touch as a silent request for permission to enter that circle of pain. Grace felt Will's hesitation and Leo's surprised stiffness. She was the balance between them, the bridge across the chasm of silence that separated them. With Leo's head still nestled on her shoulder, she didn't look at Will, but her words were clearly meant for him as much as for the boy. "It's okay, Leo," she whispered, her voice soft as velvet. "It's Daddy. He's right here with us. He heard you and came running, honey." She was narrating Will's actions, giving them a meaning that perhaps even he himself couldn't articulate. She was transforming his awkward presence into an act of love and bravery. For Leo, her words were permission to accept this strange touch, to understand that his father was not a threat but an ally. For Will, her words were encouragement, validation. She wasn't shutting him out. On the contrary, I was creating a space for him, inviting him to participate in that moment of healing, not as a helpless spectator, but as an essential and necessary part of it. Hidden in the darkness of the hallway, Brenda witnessed the scene and felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She saw her employer, the proud Will Carter, kneeling on the floor like a supplicant. She saw the interloper, Grace, not only comforting the boy, but orchestrating his father's reconciliation. She was conducting an emotional symphony, for which Brenda had no score. And deep down, the housekeeper knew she never would. A cold wave of irrelevance washed over her. For years, she had been the rock of this house, the keeper of routines and memories. But she knew only how to deal with order, not with the chaos of grief. She knew how to keep the house running, but not how to mend the broken hearts within it. The image of the three of them, Will, Grace, and Leo, forming a new center of gravity, excluded her completely. She was not part of that equation. With wounded dignity, she took a step back, retreating into the shadows. Without a sound, she turned and walked back to her chambers, each step an acknowledgement of her defeat. It had not been a battle of shouts and orders, but a battle of souls, and she had lost. Caroline's era, and her role as her primary guardian, had ended that night. Grace's words gave Will the anchor he needed. He took a deep breath and found his own voice, which came out scratchy and choked. "It's true, son. Daddy's here," he said, the words sounding strange and yet perfectly right in his own mouth. He leaned closer, his face now close to Leo's hair. "Leo, I'm sorry." The confession was a breakthrough. I'm sorry you're going through this. I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner. I really am." The apology wasn't just for the nights of nightmares, but for every day he'd been away, for every meeting he'd prioritized, for every business trip, for every night he'd locked himself in his office with a bottle of bourbon instead of sitting by his son's bedside. It was an admission of failure, spoken out loud, stripped of any pride. In that moment, he wasn't the oil tycoon, the pillar of Dallas society. He was just a father, broken and remorseful, asking his son for forgiveness. His father's voice, so raw and full of pain, was what finally reached Leo from the depths of his grief. Slowly, he lifted his head from Grace's shoulder. His eyes, red and puffy from crying, met Will's, and for the first time, he truly saw his father. Not the tall, hurried figure who had walked past him in the hallway, not the commanding voice speaking on the phone. He saw a man with eyes shining with unshed tears, with the same pain he felt in his own heart. In an instant of profound, childlike clarity, Leo understood that the monster who haunted him in his dreams also haunted his father during the day. They were not grieving separately. They were sharing the same wound. This silent realization was more powerful than any conversation. The chasm between them, built over months of silence and distance, was suddenly bridged by a fragile but real bridge of mutual empathy. Fueled by this new connection, Leo made a gesture that redefined the future of everyone in the room. He released his arm from Grace's grasp and held out his small, trembling hand to Will. It was a silent invitation, an offering of peace. Will felt his heart skip a beat. With a gentleness that belied his large, calloused hands, he took Leo's hand, feeling the small, fragile fingers close around his. That simple touch was an acceptance. It was forgiveness. Feeling this new bond, Will leaned forward, and Grace, sensing the moment, moved too, wrapping her other arm around Leo. The three of them met in a group hug. awkward and imperfect. Leo's head was nestled between Grace's soft shoulder and Will's firm chest, which smelled of bourbon and expensive cologne. It was a survivor's embrace, a circle of warmth and tears that shielded them from the chill of the night and the memory. In that moment, they stopped being three individuals suffering alone and became a unit, a family being forged in the fire of shared pain. For a long time they remained like that, a tangle of arms and broken hearts. Leo's violent crying faded to soft sobs and then to a breathless silence. The only sound in the room was their breathing, gradually finding a common rhythm. The air, once thick with panic, was now heavy with a different emotion, a cleansing emotion. It was a sacred stillness. Will felt the warmth of his son's body against his, a real living weight that anchored him to the present. He was no longer on the side of the road, no longer in his lonely office. He was here, exactly where he needed to be. Grace, her face pressed against Leo's hair, closed her eyes, feeling a sense of belonging so intense it was almost overwhelming. She was no longer a loose end, an outsider. In that embrace she had found a place. The storm had passed, and in its place had been left a weary but deeply connected calm. It was Will who spoke first, his voice a whisper so as not to break the peace. "How about I stay here with you, champ?" he said, the Texan nickname coming naturally. "Until the sun comes up. I'm not going anywhere." It was the most important promise he could make. It wasn't about buying a new toy or planning a trip. It was a promise to be there. The one thing money couldn't buy and the one thing Leo really needed. The exhausted boy could only nod, snuggling deeper into his father's chest. The security of that promise was the best medicine. Feeling that her role as bridge had been fulfilled, and that this was a moment that belonged to father and son, Grace began to pull away, relaxing her embrace to give them space. It was the professional thing to do. But as soon as she moved, Leo's small hand, still holding her arm, tightened. The gesture was weak, but desperate. Grace stopped. She looked at the boy's face. His eyes were almost closed with exhaustion, but they opened a little, and there was a clear plea in them. "You too, Grace," he whispered, his voice sleepy. "Please stay." It wasn't a choice he was offering. It was a necessity. He didn't want his father or Grace. He wanted his father and Grace. He wanted his new circle of safety to remain intact. Will looked at Grace over Leo's head, and his gaze was not that of a boss, but that of a partner. His eyes silently echoed his son's plea. In that moment, Grace's employment contract was symbolically torn apart. She was no longer the caretaker. She was the other half of the anchor that was keeping this little family afloat. And staying was no longer a professional choice, but a human necessity. Leo's plea, "Please stay," was all the permission Grace needed. In that instant, the voices in her head that screamed about professionalism, about boundaries, about the dangers of getting too involved were silenced. The raw, honest need in that child's eyes was a force far more powerful than any rule of professional etiquette. Staying was no longer a choice. It was an instinctive response to a human call. She looked at Will, and the relief that flooded his face was so palpable it almost made her cry. He didn't have to say anything. His grateful look was an agreement, a new contract being signed not in ink, but in shared vulnerability. She gave a slight nod, a silent yes that meant so much more than just agreeing to spend the night. It meant she was accepting a place in this circle of pain, no longer as a paid observer, but as an active participant in the delicate process of rebuilding what had been broken. With the decision made, a strange and tender logistics unfolded in the shadows. Will, driven by a newly awakened paternal instinct, took the lead. "Let's get settled," he murmured, his voice still husky. With a gentleness that belied his imposing frame, he helped Leo lie back down, propping his head and shoulders on a pile of soft pillows. He pulled the cotton quilt over the boy's chest, his movements a little clumsy, but full of careful intention. Then he sat on the edge of the bed to Leo's right and took his son's hand, holding it in both of his. He looked across the bed at Grace, a silent invitation in his eyes. She understood and sat on the other edge, taking Leo's other hand. The boy was now in the center, a link between the two adults anchored on either side. The scene was almost a tableau, a triangle of silent protection, and the way they arranged themselves without words was the first act of their new, undefined partnership in healing. A new silence settled over the room. It was a silence unlike any other the house had ever known. It wasn't the empty silence of mourning or the tense silence of avoidance. It was a full, shared silence, a silence of wakefulness. The only sound was Leo's breathing, which deepened with each passing minute, becoming the steady, soothing rhythm that governed the room. The stars of the projector continued to rotate slowly on the ceiling, but now they seemed less like a technological device and more like a private celestial vault, bearing witness to this moment of fragile peace. Grace could feel Leo's gentle pulse beneath her fingers, a rhythmic throb that grounded her own anxious thoughts. Across the room she could see Will's silhouette motionless, a mountain of solid presence. In this stillness, in this shared space, they were not the tycoon, the waitress, and the sick boy. They were just three people, bound together by the night, breathing the same air, sharing the same purpose, to make sure the darkness would never return. As the hours slowly passed, Will stared at his son's sleeping face and felt a tectonic shift taking place within him. The guilt, his constant companion, began to recede, giving way to a painful but necessary clarity. He realized that his grief for Caroline had become an excuse for his own paralysis. He had hidden behind his pain, using it as a shield to avoid facing the daunting task of being a single father to a traumatized child. Honoring Caroline, he realized that night, was not about turning the house into a museum of her memory. It was about ensuring that the son she loved so much could live and laugh and dream again. And he could not do that alone. His gaze moved across the dark room and found Grace's profile. The gratitude he felt for her was immense, but it was more than that. It was respect. He respected her courage, her calm, her quiet strength. She was not here for the money or the status. She was here for Leo. And in doing this for Leo, she was freeing him too, showing him a way out of his own prison of pain. For the first time in months, Leo's sleep was a refuge, not a battlefield. On some deep, unconscious level, his mind registered the new reality. The terror of his dreams was fueled by loneliness, by the feeling of being adrift in an endless darkness. But tonight, he wasn't adrift. He was anchored. On one side, he felt his father's solid, steady presence, a strength he hadn't felt in a long time, like a great tree providing shelter. On the other, he felt Grace's soft, persistent warmth, a small but unwavering light that kept the shadows at bay. These two sensations, strength and warmth, created a perimeter of safety around his sleeping mind. The monsters from his memory might still exist on the fringes of his subconscious, but they could no longer cross this new boundary of protection. For the first time, sleep was not a fall into the abyss, but a rest in a safe harbor. Time dissolved in the darkness of the room. There was no conversation, only the silent communication of their shared presence. Sometime in the deepest hours of the night, Will looked up and his eyes met Grace's. She was not asleep. She was as alert as he was. He didn't know what to say. "Thank you" seemed like a small and worn-out word for the immensity of what he felt. So he said nothing. He just looked at her, and in that look he tried to put all his gratitude, his regret, and his admiration. Grace understood him perfectly. In response, she gave him a tiny smile, a tired smile, but one that carried infinite compassion and understanding. That smile said, "I know, and it's okay. We're in this together." In that silence, in that exchange of glances, they established a new pact, a new alliance forged not in words, but in the mutual experience of having gone through hell together to save a boy they both loved. Even after Leo's breathing had become the deep, steady sound of a dreamless sleep, neither of them dared move. Leaving, breaking the circle, felt like a betrayal. They each had their own reasons for staying. Will stayed as an act of penance. Every waking minute was atonement for months of absence. He was learning how to be a father again, not through grand gestures, but through the simple, profound act of being present. He soaked up the peace of that room as if his life depended on it, and maybe it did. Grace stayed for a different reason. She stayed because she understood that peace was fragile. She felt that her presence was part of the equation that maintained the balance. But more than that, she stayed because for the first time in a long time, she felt at home. In that dark room, holding the hand of a wounded child next to a broken man, she found a sense of purpose and belonging that surprised her. She knew her life had changed forever. The line between work and heart had been irrevocably blurred. As the epicenter of the mansion found a new equilibrium, change spread. In her room, Brenda couldn't sleep. She sat in a chair staring into the darkness, listening to the silence. But it was a different silence. It wasn't the tense silence she knew. It was a silence of resolution, a silence that left her out. The house, her domain, seemed to have found a new heart, a new center of gravity, and it pulsed in Leo's room. She felt like a queen exiled to her own castle. Her power, built on order, routine, and loyalty to Caroline's memory, had become obsolete in the face of a force she could not control, the power of human connection and emotional healing. For her, the night had brought not the victory of order, but the painful realization that life stubbornly moves on, and that sometimes the best way to honor the past is to allow the future to happen. The first hint of gray in the Dallas sky heralded the arrival of dawn. The dim blue light that filtered through Leo's bedroom window was the signal that the long night of vigil was coming to an end. Will was the first to stir, his body stiff and aching from having lain in the same position for so long. With infinite care, he released Leo's hand. The boy stirred but continued to sleep soundly. Will glanced at Grace, a silent gesture for her to do the same. She did, and the physical connection that had bound them together through the night dissolved. They rose, and in the stillness of dawn, a certain strangeness settled in. The urgency of the crisis had passed, and now they were just a man and a woman, in their nightclothes, in a child's room. The raw intimacy of the night had given way to the self-consciousness of the morning. What were they to each other now? The question hung in the air, as real as the growing light streaming through the window. Will followed Grace to the bedroom door. He wanted to say something, anything, to fill this new awkward silence, but words still felt inadequate. How could he thank her? How could he explain what that night had meant to him? Before she could leave, he stopped her with a gentle touch on her arm. It was an impulsive gesture, but necessary. When she turned away, he didn't try to speak. He just looked at her, hoping his eyes could convey what his voice couldn't. Gratitude, respect, and the silent promise that this was not the end, but the beginning. The promise that he would never go back to being the man he had been before that night. Grace, he whispered, and her name was the only word that mattered. She nodded, a deep understanding passing between them. "Rest well, Will," she said softly, and then she was gone, leaving him there, in the doorway, a father finally on guard, watching over his sleeping son as the Texas sun began to rise, bringing with it the promise of a whole new day. The Texas sunlight, bright and unrelenting, poured into the Carter mansion, cutting through the gloom and making dust particles dance in the air. It was a light that left no room for ambiguity. Grace woke in her soft bed after a heavy but short sleep, feeling exhausted to the bone. The night before had felt like a feverish movie, a sequence of emotions so raw and intense that her mind struggled to process them as reality. She sat up, staring at her hands, remembering the feel of Leo's small hand in hers, Will's tentative touch. The silence in the house that morning was different. It wasn't the oppressive silence of grief, but an expectant stillness, like a field after a storm, the air clear, and the earth ready for something new to sprout. She knew, with a certainty that both terrified and exhilarated her, that her role in this house and in their lives had been permanently redefined in the darkness of the previous night. Will didn't sleep. He spent the rest of the night in Leo's bedroom chair, a silent sentinel watching over his son's calm breathing. Watching Leo sleep peacefully, free from the spasms of terror, was more restorative to him than any night of sleep. By the time the first rays of sunlight touched the window, a new determination had crystallized within him. He reached for his smartphone, a tool that for months had been his escape and his prison. He ignored the barrage of emails about oil prices and market reports. He found his executive assistant's number and, instead of typing, used the voice function, her voice steady and clear in the morning silence. "Cheryl, good morning. Cancel my entire schedule for today. The investor meeting, the conference call with Houston, everything. Reschedule what's possible, cancel what's not. It's an urgent family matter." It was the first time in years that the word family had taken precedence over the word business. It was a small act, but for him it was a revolution. After a quick shower, Grace dressed in her usual clothes, jeans and a simple t-shirt, but the clothes felt strange, like a costume from a play she was no longer performing. Who was she now? The question echoed in her mind as she descended the grand curved staircase. The dread of facing the day was palpable. How would Will treat her? Would they pretend the intimacy of the night before, forged in the fires of crisis, had never happened? And Brenda? The thought of meeting the housekeeper made Grace's stomach knot. Brenda would now see her not just as a threat, but as an accomplice to a breach of protocol, a witness to her employer's vulnerability. Grace felt as if she were walking a tightrope, with no safety net over unfamiliar territory. Every step toward the kitchen was a step toward an uncertain future that had begun with the sound of a scream in the night. The kitchen was spotless, as always, the smell of fresh coffee and bacon wafting through the air. Brenda stood at the granite counter, polishing silverware with a fierce, focused energy, each movement an act of control in a world she felt was slipping away from her grasp. She heard Grace's footsteps but didn't turn around. Only when Grace was a few feet away did she speak, without looking up from her spoon polishing. "Good morning, Ms. Evans." Formality was a weapon. The use of Ms. Evans was a deliberate attempt to rebuild the professional wall that had crumbled the night before. It was her way of saying, "Nothing has changed. You're still the housekeeper." Grace could feel the chill in the air, but she refused to be intimidated. "Good morning, Brenda," she replied, her voice calm and steady, using the housekeeper's first name in a subtle defiance of formality. The battle for new territory in this house was being fought with words and titles. The tension in the kitchen was cut by Will's arrival. He looked tired, the dark circles under his eyes, but there was a new clarity in his gaze. He entered, not like a whirlwind of business, but with a calm, centered presence. "Good morning," he said, his voice ringing in the room. He gave Brenda a nod, a formal acknowledgement, but his eyes immediately sought Grace's. And then, standing in front of Brenda, his expression softened. "Grace," he said, and her name sounded different, softer. "Did you get any rest?" The question was loaded with meaning, an island of shared intimacy in the middle of the tense kitchen. By asking it like that, Will was sending a clear message. He was aligning himself with Grace. He was acknowledging their partnership, forged the night before. For Brenda, it was like hearing a verdict. For Grace, it was the relief of knowing she was not alone in this strange new frontier. Leo woke slowly, emerging from a deep, dreamless sleep. The first thing he noticed was the sunlight streaming through the window, brighter than usual. And the second thing was the figure of his father, sitting in the armchair next to his bed. He wasn't reading the paper or talking on the phone. He was just there, watching him. The sight was so extraordinary that Leo blinked, thinking that perhaps he was still dreaming. The memory of the night before came back to him in flashes, the overwhelming fear, the screaming, and then the feeling of warmth and safety, the feeling of being held by two people at once. He looked at his father, and the fear he usually felt in his presence had been replaced by a quiet curiosity. "Dad?" His voice came out sleepily. Will smiled, a genuine smile. "Good morning, champ." "I'm here." Leo settled back into the pillows. "Are you still here?" he asked, the wonder clear in his voice. His father's presence was no longer a passing event, but a constant. "I'm still here, and I'm not going anywhere," Will replied, the promise in his voice solid as a rock. He stood and sat on the edge of the bed, completely ignoring the routine Brenda had established for years. "How are you feeling?" Leo thought for a moment, unsure how to articulate the absence of terror. Then he gave the most honest answer he could. "I'm hungry." Will laughed, a genuine relaxed sound that echoed around the room. "Great answer. So am I. What does my partner want for breakfast?" And instead of calling out to Brenda, Will helped him get ready himself. His movements were clumsy. He fumbled with Leo's shoes and had to ask where his toothbrushes were. But every awkward gesture was an act of love. It was the first time in months that Will had actively participated in his son's morning routine, relearning the small rituals of fatherhood one step at a time. Breakfast was a scene the likes of which the mansion had never witnessed before. The three of them, Will, Leo, and Grace, sat together at the enormous dining table, a space usually reserved for holidays or business dinners. Brenda served the food in icy silence, her presence a shadow of disapproval, but the atmosphere at the table was undeniably different. It was light. Will didn't touch his phone. He chatted with Leo, asking about his doll, Bevo, and the planets he saw on his projector. And he naturally and consistently included Grace in the conversation. "Grace, do you think we could ever visit NASA in Houston?" he asked, looking at her across the table. The "we" was intentional. He was weaving her into the fabric of his family one stitch at a time. It was a performance of a happy family, but there was an authenticity to it, a genuine effort that made it feel less like a performance and more like a rehearsal for a real future. Despite the light conversation, the elephant in the room was barely visible. The previous night, with its terror and its catharsis, loomed over the breakfast table. Both Will and Grace felt the weight of the unspoken subject. Will was deeply afraid that by mentioning it, he would reignite Leo's trauma. His inclination was to protect, to build a wall of normalcy around the event, hoping it would go away. He worried that any word would be the wrong spark. Grace, however, felt otherwise. She knew that monsters didn't disappear when ignored. They only grew stronger in the darkness. She believed that Leo needed to know that it was safe to talk about his fears, that naming the monster was the first step to taking away its power. She searched for an opening, a gentle way to broach the subject, but the conversation flowed around him, like a river diverting around a large rock. The tension between Will's protective instinct and Grace's therapeutic approach was a silent undercurrent beneath the morning calm. And then, like a child who knows nothing of adults' fear of touching wounds, it was Leo himself who picked up the scalpel. He finished his orange juice, wiped his mouth with a napkin, and looked at the two adults with a seriousness that belied his age. "Thank you," he said, his voice ringing clear and steady in the dining room. "For last night." Will and Grace paused, their gazes fixed on him. Leo looked down at his plate. "I don't like that dream," he admitted quietly, "but it was better with you two there. I didn't feel alone." The simplicity of the statement was overwhelming. He wasn't focusing on terror, but on comfort. He wasn't asking them to erase the past, but thanking them for being with him in the present. With his disarming honesty, Leo hadn't just addressed the elephant in the room, he'd tamed it. He gave Will and Grace the permission they didn't know how to ask for. Permission to speak, to heal, and to be one. Not just against nightmares, but for life. Leo's simple words sent a shockwave of raw emotion through the dinner table. Will felt the tears he had held back for so long finally burn in his eyes. He didn't hide them. He let Grace and his son see his vulnerability. Leaning across the table, he covered Leo's small hand with his own. "We'll always be here for you, champ," he said, his voice cracking but firm. "Always. You'll never face another bad dream alone again. That's a father's promise." It was an oath, sealed not with words but with the raw truth of the night before. Grace, on the other side, reached out and placed her hand gently over Will and Leo's, her touch completing the circle. Her own eyes were brimming with tears. In that moment, their pact was solidified, not by a contract or an adult conversation, but by the honest declaration of a child who showed them the way out of the darkness. Feeling secure in this new pact, Will risked another step into unfamiliar territory. He looked at Leo, his voice gentle. "Son, do you think maybe talking about the dream a little when you're ready might help make it less scary?" He gave Leo all the control, all the agency. Leo thought for a moment, his eyes small and serious. He shook his head. "I don't want to talk about the car," he said, his voice low. And then he looked at them both, a new light of understanding in his gaze. "But we can talk about Mom, about the good things. Maybe that will help chase away the bad things." It was an unusually wise proposition. He was instinctively suggesting the most effective therapy, replacing the memories of trauma with memories of love. He didn't want to focus on how his mother died, but on how she lived. And in doing so, he gave Will and Grace not just permission to heal, but a roadmap for how to begin. In the kitchen, leaning against the granite counter, Brenda listened to Leo's proposal. And that was when the last of her defenses crumbled. She, who had spent months trying to preserve Caroline's memory through fresh gardenias and polished photographs, realized she was doing it all wrong. She was preserving pain, not love. Leo, in his innocence, understood what she could not. Honoring Caroline was not about clinging to the silence of grief, but about celebrating the joy of her life. A lonely, bitter tear ran down her wrinkled cheek. It was the tear of her own rigidity, her own fear. She looked down at her hands, which for so long had kept this house in perfect order, and realized that the real disorder lay not in Leo's toys or Grace's methods, but in her own heart. In a silent act of surrender, she turned away and began packing a picnic basket. If she could no longer be the guardian of the past, perhaps she could somehow help nurture the future. "Telling Mom about all the good things," Will repeated, his voice full of admiration. "That's the best idea I've ever heard." He turned to his son, a new sense of purpose in his eyes. "And since I canceled all my work today, what do you say we do it somewhere she loved?" Leo looked at him expectantly. How about we go to White Rock Lake? We can sit on the grass, skip a few rocks in the water like we used to. Leo's suggestion wasn't just about going to a park. It was about reclaiming a place that had been tainted by pain. It was an act of bravery, an attempt to create new happy memories out of the old ones. Will felt a surge of pride in his son. "Hack your cap, champ," he said with a smile that lit up his entire face. "Let's go to the lake." For once, the future didn't seem like an abyss of empty days, but a series of small, possible new beginnings. The house was transformed by the preparations for the outing. The silence filled with the sounds of a family preparing for an adventure. Will's hurried footsteps searching for a pair of casual shoes he hadn't worn in years. Grace's laughter as she helped Leo decide which shirt to wear. The sound of Leo's chair wheels on the hardwood floor. No longer a sound of restraint but of excitement. The mansion was waking from a long slumber. As they neared the door, Brenda appeared, holding a classic wicker basket. Without a word, she held it out to Grace. Inside were sandwiches, a thermos of lemonade, and a jar of Leo's favorite chocolate chip cookies. "It might get cold by the lake," was all she said, her voice neutral, but her eyes avoided Grace's. It was her peace offering, her apology, spoken in the language of care, the only language she knew. Grace took the basket and nodded. "Thank you, Brenda." The truce was sealed. As Leo said goodbye to his Bevo doll, promising to return soon, Will and Grace found themselves alone for a moment in the grand foyer. Sunlight streamed in through the tall windows, illuminating the dust in the air. Will turned to Grace, the need to tell her what he felt overwhelming. "Grace," he began, his voice serious. "What happened last night, I need you to know. You didn't just calm my son. You showed me the way back. I was lost, more lost than I'd ever been, and I was dragging Leo down with me. You stepped into the darkness when I was too afraid to even look at it." He paused, swallowing hard. "You didn't just save Leo last night. You saved me from myself." It was the most honest confession he'd ever made, an admission of his own fragility that, paradoxically, made him feel stronger than ever. Grace listened to Will's confession, and her heart filled with an emotion that was a mix of compassion and deep respect. She saw the man behind the tycoon, the father behind the pain. "You weren't afraid, Will. You were grieving," she corrected gently. "And you didn't stand outside. You walked into the room. You knelt. You stayed. That was the bravest thing you could have done." She smiled a little. "And to be honest, I think we all needed each other last night." With that sentence, she absolved him of his guilt and reset the dynamic between them. This wasn't a story about a heroine rescuing a family. It was a story about three broken people who, together, found a way to begin to mend themselves. They were equals on this journey, each giving what they could, each taking what they needed. The moment they left the mansion was a symbolic act. Will, their now present and active father, pushed Leo's wheelchair with quiet confidence. Grace walked beside them, holding the basket Brenda had given them, an emblem of their newly declared peace. As they passed through the imposing front door and into the bright Texas sunlight, it was as if they were crossing a border. They left behind the house that had been a shrine to pain, a museum of frozen memories, and they walked toward a new day. They were no longer just an employer, his maid, and a sick child. They were a unit in the making, a constellation of 3 points of light moving together out of the darkness. The sound of Leo's wheelchair wheels on the stone path, the only sound, a steady rhythm of progress toward the future. In the park, near the quiet shores of White Rock Lake, life seemed simple. The air smelled of grass and damp earth. They found a spot under the shade of a large oak tree and spread out a blanket. There was no big talk or dramatic moments. There was the quiet beauty of normality. Leo, his face lit up with a genuine smile, was trying to skip rocks in the water, Will helping him find the flattest rocks. Grace watched them, and the image of them, a father and son laughing together in the sunshine, was the most beautiful work of art she had ever seen. It was a scene of peace, a peace that had been hard-won the night before. The terror of the nightmare had not been forgotten, but it had become the fertile soil from which that sunny, happy afternoon could grow. It was proof that even from the deepest wounds, joy could grow again. That night, the night a boy's scream broke the silence of a family, was not the end of their story. It was the beginning of everything. It did not erase the scar left by the loss of Caroline, but it transformed it from an open wound into a memorial of love that could coexist with life. What they learned in that darkness was not to forget, but to remember in a different way. As they confronted the trauma together, Will, Grace, and Leo discovered that vulnerability was not a weakness, but the strongest bridge between people. The family that began to form under the Texas sun was not built to replace the one that was gone, but built on its foundations, honoring the past by having the courage to embrace the future. And so an oil tycoon learned that his true wealth was presence. A waitress discovered that her true calling was healing hearts. And a boy taught them both that even after the darkest night, the Texas sun always rises again. She didn't seek a tycoon's fortune. She just wanted to calm a boy's fears. And in doing so, she ended up giving a father the courage to feel, and a family the permission to start over. Sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves from pain are the same ones that trap us in loneliness. Life can teach us to be strong alone, but it is the unexpected connections that teach us to be resilient together. It is when we dare to share our fragility that we discover our true strength. If this story touched your heart, as it did Grace's, Will's, Leo's, and even Brenda's, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other journeys that remind us that the greatest cures come not from the most expensive medicines, but from the simplest gestures of compassion. Because seeing someone else's pain is the first step to healing our own.